Here he has founded and directed the Center for Latinx Digital Media and the Master of Science in Leadership and Creative Enterprises program. So among many other programs he's organized and started, he's the co-founder and co-director of the Center of the Study of Media and Society in Argentina, which is a joint initiative between Northwestern and the University in Buenos Aires. His research uses a comparative framework to examine the dynamics of digital culture, paying particular attention to information or misinformation, and particularly in the Global South. While he's published several books and articles across many journals, his latest book, Abundance, was published this summer, and it examines the cultural and social factors that make information abundant in Argentina. And it looks like we get to hear more about that today. So welcome.
Indeed. Thank you very much. I'm going to turn this on. Can you hear me? Yeah. All right. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'm sorry in giving the talk with a mask, but just for safety reasons. So it's truly a pleasure to be here. I was reminiscent with Jamie that I gave a very early version of some preliminary findings here about 3 or 4 years ago. Many of the questions actually were very helpful for me to think through. I hope I have done a good job. The reviewers said it was good enough to get it published, but we'll see whether this august audience thinks the same. And again, thank you very much for being here and on the screen. What I hope to do for the next hour is to transport you 10,000 kilometers south, not only in terms of location, but in terms also of style of analysis and mode of argumentation. And what the book deals with is with a massive increase in the information available that people in the world have experienced over the past quarter century, in particular over the past 10 years. But it is not the first time, I argue in the book, that societies have gone through a massive surge in the information available. It happened in antiquity, and much like today, where we see the dystopic and the utopian views sort of argued, Seneca and Pliny the Elder sort of embodied essentially the social dilemma and the counter to the social dilemma, which I now have forgotten the title. But nonetheless, antiquity, the early modern period, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment did not see the numbers that we are seeing today. Over 25 billion cell phones, smart actually cell phones, were sold in the world between 1998 and 2019. Essentially, 3 cell phones per inhabitant or a little bit more of this planet. 4.5 billion is the number of people who are on at least one social media platform as of January 1st of this year. Those who are on social media are on average on 6.6 platforms. The number has probably risen, given that the population of the world is about 7.8 billion. This is more than half. And if you exclude very, very young people and very old people and people who, for a number of reasons, would not have infrastructural access to technologies, probably 2/3 of the world who are on social media. The number below, close to 100,000, was the number of entries that the keyword search on CNN.com in October of last year, when he was still president of this country, a keyword search on with the terms Donald Trump elicited in a fraction of a second, right, on my computer at home. Almost 100,000 articles that I had access almost immediately. Growing up in Argentina in the 70s and 80s, if I had gone to the National Library of Buenos Aires and did a keyword search for the then sitting president of the States or the then sitting president of Argentina, I would have retrieved a fraction of these articles. And it would have taken me months, if not years, to get access to them because they had to be delivered to me, right? But we didn't have access to the collections. And 14,000 is the number of titles available in the Netflix catalog worldwide, give or take. It's not a precise number, nobody knows it. During the spring of this year, this is the global catalog. Different countries have access to different titles because of intellectual property rights. In the States, it's about 5,000 and change. In Argentina, it's 3,500. This is only one streaming company, and most of these titles are serialized fiction, right? They are not movies, so they have many seasons and many episodes per season. If we include all the streaming services worldwide, we are now above 100,000 available titles. So if I want to do absolutely nothing but eat, sleep, and watch Netflix for the remainder of my life, I could probably not exhaust the content that is available today. Again, we have not been here for the first, we are not here for the first time now. We've been here before as a society. And that's why both in the social and the behavioral sciences, there's been substantive theorizing about how to understand a society that confronts a massive influx, right, in the information available that leads, in some cases, to a quantitative leap. In the social sciences, probably the canonical starting point is Zimmel's 1903 work on the transition from agrarian societies to urban societies. My favorite there is Stanley Milgram's 1970 piece in Science, which starts with an incredible quote about somebody, entering Grand Central, but Grand Central Terminal in New York, but I leave that up to you. And in the behavioral sciences, one of the leading examples is George Miller's, I think it was in the 50s, is 1956, famous article, 7 plus or minus 2, how many units of information can the brain process, remember, etc. But underneath the different take from the different authors, there has been a common pattern, which is this idea that there is an optimum of information that the person or a collective, be that small team or even an organization, can process in order to make the best possible decisions. And after that, it's all downhill. It's an inverted U shape. More information adds noise, adds complication, etc. Doesn't add much. So cutting across the diversity of this work from the cultural sociology of Todd Gitlin to the neuroscience of Levitin, there is this idea that there is an optimum of information, right? And that most of what happens is that we are processing information to making decisions. The notion of information overload has a series of characteristics that I argue in the book are limited to try to understand how people in their daily lives experience having to choose between 750 maybe Netflix titles that the algorithm shows you when you're trying to figure out what to watch, and you end up watching nothing but previews of the titles that you're trying to decide what to watch, right? So that's why I call the book Abundance. The main sort of characteristics of the idea of information overload that are to me somewhat limited in the present case are: number one, the idea that we use information mostly to make decisions, whereas what I found in the interviews, I'll tell you about the data in a minute, what I found in the interview and when I reflect in my daily life is that all of this information sometimes is to make decisions, sometimes is to entertain ourselves, sometimes is to relate to others, sometimes is to manage the logistics of everyday life. There are multiple uses of information. Now, if you are focusing on using information to making decisions, therefore, is relevant to have mostly a cognitive focus. But if you are focusing on the multiple uses of information, a lot of that has to do with interpretation, not necessarily information processing. What we think things mean to us, and that, in part relates to the emotions that the different units of information elicit in us when we encounter that, and also to the routines and the practices that we enact to handle this massive influx of information in our daily life. I woke up this morning after putting my mobile phone on airplane mode, and I had over 700 new messages on various WhatsApp groups, some of which highly relevant, some of which highly irrelevant, and of all kinds, right? So one has to enact a series of routines so that not to get drowned on the amount of information that we have at our disposal. Most of the research has tended to focus on making decisions in workplace settings where there are a series of parameters that perhaps justify this idea of optimality and the resulting discourse of deficit that is related to the downhill, right? The inverted U shape. But in everyday life, if we are using information for many different reasons, in many contexts, for many different purposes, it's harder to maintain the assumption of optimality, right? For instance, the first part of the 5th season of my favorite Netflix show, Casa de Papel in Spanish. This is a Spanish thriller, Money Heist, came out on September 3rd. I was on vacation, and my older daughter and I actually went through the entire thing in 2 sittings. Was it an optimal use of our time in a beautiful Caribbean island? Perhaps not, some might say, but we had an absolutely delightful time, and with air conditioning. So what I propose in the book is to replace this idea of the discourse of deficit with a notion of evaluation that is emergent. And it depends on a number of contextual factors and motivational factors for the people who are at stake in terms of our analysis. And finally, most of the research on information overload has adopted an ethic perspective, has relied mostly on quantitative methods. Since I am trying to understand the experience, interpretations, the affects, the practices, right? I rely in part on an ethic perspective, but also on an emic perspective using ethnographic field research to try to understand what things mean to the people that I'm trying to study. So the main question that I try to answer in the book is essentially a question: what is the experience of living in a world in which we are surrounded by information? And it breaks it down in 3 very simple questions. The first one is which are the macrostructural patterns, right? That structure, that organize access to the technologies whereby we get this information when it's not co-located face-to-face interaction, and the content that comes through these devices. Second question is, once we have these structural parameters figured out, which are the micro and meso level cultural dynamics, mostly the constellations of meanings and the routines that people enact, right? That mediate and shape between having a lot of information and how different people experience that process. And finally, what this means for media, for society, and for politics. To answer these questions, in the book, I develop a 4-pronged approach. First one, I take a page from the communication scholar, unfortunately long gone, Jim Carrey, who said that one can understand the study of communication through 2 different prisms. The first one is a transmission view of communication, where the idea is that information moves from point to point, either inside the brain, within groups, in societies, etc. The second one, which is the one that I adopt in this book, is that people ritualistically make meaning of information as they go on their daily lives, right? And making meaning is a collective enterprise that is in no small measure having to do with the routines, the practices, the affect, and the experience related to this process. A lot of the scholarship on information technology and society has been undertaken with a division of labor that has tended to separate those who study the technological infrastructure and technological systems and those who study the content aspect of it. And within those who study the content aspect, there are the people who study news and political information, and the people who study popular culture and entertainment. All of that is great for specialization and the advancement of science in specialization, as long as it's not too divorced or too different from how people are actually living their daily lives. Somewhat that slice means in the general content. And what I will argue, apparently the internet connection is unstable, talking about technology, glad that it is restored. What I argue in the book, and if we examine our daily lives, we are not saying, oh, now I'm consuming news and now I'm using a device. We are going in and out of social media, our windows on the computer screen, we are writing a paper and then we get an alert and then we switch about the news, or maybe a family member contacts us on WhatsApp and we are reading what we see that WhatsApp message on the phone, but we go to the screen because we can see better, etc. So people are getting in and out of this. So in order to try to make sense of the relationship between technology and content and between news, social media content, and entertainment, I try to combine insights from all of these fields. I try to also, even though my approach is mostly cultural, try to embed the cultural approach within a structural understanding of access and use of technology and information. And even though most of my focus is today I am mindful of the fact that this is not the first time in history that we go through this, and there is very important historical insights that allow us to position the current moment, both in terms of patterns of continuity and also to assess what might be novel about the current state. And finally, 99% of scholarship has been undertaken in the 14% of the world that lives in the countries of the global north. This book tries to provide an alternative view, not just because it's a different part of the world, but because there are particular features about the Argentine context that make it a very relevant and suitable case to try to examine what goes on in the experience of living in a world of information plenty. The research draws for 158 semi-structured interviews that were undertaken in Buenos Aires and the suburbs and 4 of the provinces. Buenos Aires and suburbs is about 37% of the country's population. The other provinces would add another 10% or so. So it's not the entire country. I did not find major differences between urban and rural. So I am fairly confident about the quality of the data regarding the interviews. And then I embedded that within a survey that was conducted within a third of the process of the fieldwork, informed by preliminary results. Because of financial constraints, the survey was conducted only in Buenos Aires and the suburbs, because I wanted to do a face-to-face to capture lots of people who might not access online. So there is a limitation there. However, the national government, the Ministry of Culture, conducted before and after the time I did my survey, a national representative survey of 2,000 people in the country. I got access to their data and to their results, and they're fairly consistent with our results. So I feel comfortable with the quality of the survey data as well. So why Argentina, in addition to the fact that I miss my country very much, and the longer I stay in this country, the more Argentine I become? There are 3, I believe, features of the country's history, culture, and economy that make it a particularly interesting place to try to answer the questions that I posed at the beginning. First of all, societies in the global north relative to middle-income and low-income countries have much more material wealth. So it costs much less relative to income to get one of these devices than in a country like Argentina, which at the time of the study had 35% of the population below the level of poverty. That is essentially $10 per household a day at the time of the study. So for people to get access to a smartphone and have WhatsApp, which 70% of the country does, right? It means a lot to them to do that. So it must mean something very important to be connected in that way. So it allows us to understand, in a situation of relative more material scarcity, what information means to people and why they are willing to fork so much of their discretionary income in order to get access to this wealth of information. Second, one of the main topics that has been explored by a number of colleagues about this experience and the effect of having a lot of information in everyday life has to do with the quality of our interpersonal relationships. Sherry Turkle is probably, at MIT, is probably the most visible case in point. We are all becoming much more lonely, et cetera, she argues, but there are a number of scholars who have addressed this topic variously. Invariably, all of this research has been done in the context of a global north, where associational cultures tend to be more instrumental and more individualistic. So I wanted to probe what really happened with the quality of social ties in a context with a much stronger and more communitarian associational culture that long predates this. I mean, if you do historical research in the 19th and even 18th century, you find evidence of some of the same relational patterns in family life and friendship that you see today in Argentina. So Argentina provides an interesting counterpoint to try to see whether it is the technology per se what is perhaps making us more lonely, or is the technology plus a context of pre-existing more individualistic and instrumental associational cultures. And finally, another one of the main topics in particular since 2016 in the Western world that has preoccupied not only scholars, but media commentators is this idea that this wealth of information somehow is eroding the institutions of the polity, the institutions of modernity. And a lot of this research has been, a lot of this media argumentation has been done in the context of countries in the global north with greater levels of pre-existing trust in these institutions. The States is probably an outlier for that, but Scandinavia is not and other parts is not. Argentina has had for at least, there is no greater historical data, but if you, hard data, but if you look at the historical record and the more recent data, Argentina has had for a long time high levels of distrust about the institutions of modernity in general, and in particular, the institution of the media. Just to give you one quick data point from another project that we have conducted, Argentina, as some of you know, went through lots of cycles of dictatorship during the 20th century. The most recent one was the most brutal one, 76 to 83, that led to the disappearance of 30,000 people and the killing and the exiling of many more. In a country like this right now, but I don't know right now, but when we measure this in 2019 in a different survey, the media, journalism, and the news has lower levels of trust than the military, and similar levels of trust than the police forces, which people don't normally trust there. So in Buenos Aires or in other urban centers, if your house gets burglarized, you don't talk to the police because you are afraid that the police might come to your house and might see what else you have there and might tell somebody else, that you have there that to be stolen. So that's why Argentina, in the Oxford studies at the Reuters Internet Institute for Media Consumption, has placed in the either bottom quartile or bottom quintile of trust in media and institutions in general. This is why we argue, or I argue, it provides a little bit perhaps of an avant-garde of what might happen in other countries in the global north, given that the global trend is towards a decrease of trust. The book is organized into 6 chapters, an intro and an outro, and 4 empirical chapters, 2 having to do with the technologies of information abundance, if you were, the hardware, chapter 2, which is personal screens, the computer and the television set, the 5 top platforms, social media platforms that people use in their daily lives, and then 2 of the main kinds of content that are not social media content, news and entertainment. So I want to give you for the next 20 minutes a little bit of a taste about the news chapter. I'd be happy to talk about any of the others in the Q&A. Now, if we think about the scholarship on media consumption in traditional media that was undertaken since the 50s in the States with Leo Bogart until the end of the 20th century, there are 3 main findings that are important to consider in the context of the argument that I make in the book. And this is how people got the news, the reception experience in traditional media, that is print and broadcast media. First one is that news consumption was highly routinized. Right? Most people got the news in the same way every day, and they got the same outlets every day. The second one, that because it was highly routinized, it was also enacted in very predictable temporal and spatial patterns. You read, my dad read the newspaper in the same chair, in the same table, in the kitchen every morning, Monday to Friday before going to work, right? Families who watch TV in the living room, TV news in the living room in the evening. And finally, that these predictable routines were tightly integrated into everyday patterns of sociability. There are, cutting across these 3 main findings, 2 underlying assumptions that were often not made explicit, but are important to set the stage about what might be different and what might not be different today. The first one is that people had to go and obtain the information, had to buy a newspaper, either in the newsstand or had to subscribe to a newspaper, had to renew the subscription every month, had to turn on the TV, etc. When they obtained information in that way, most of the routines, right, as far as the research has described, are what I call primary. that is the main focus of attention of the person enacting that routine. Radio news consumption in the workplace in the 1970s and 80s might have been an exception, but for the most part, when people read newspaper in print, they read the newspaper. When they were watching TV, Walter Cronkite, they were watching TV, Walter Cronkite. That's a combination of the stylized version that we get from research, right? And what we know happened. There might have been deviations, but that's essentially 50 years of research condensed into one slide. So what is happening in Argentina in 2017? First of all, Argentine people tend to be highly informed about current affairs. 97% of them get the news daily. And despite all that you read about online news being it, still a world of broadcast media, as is also in the States. Okay. When you ask people about the main source of information, is TV all the way down, would have said Clifford Geertz, with radio coming down second. And then the main alternative is digital. Print culture on the way out. 3% of the 700 people said that it was their main source of information. None said magazines. Unlike in the 20th century, the information they get, they do so in a highly routinized fashion. And the older you are, the more routinized your consumption is. However, things are quite different from the picture of the 20th century. The information that people access now is information that they get 24/7, circulates at lightning speed. Any breaking news story will be on Twitter within 5 seconds, and then the news outlets will pick that up within another 30 seconds, and there will be a story about it. There is a ton of information, and most of the information that you get the same information in every news organization, with the exception, as you probably saw yesterday, when the Guardian, the Washington Post, Le Monde, El País, etc., break the story about all of these financial trials and tribulations, the New York Times buried the story and it was nowhere to be found. This is a matter of competitive pride. But for the most part, most of the news that we see in many sites. So how is it that people, right, experience a lot of that in their daily life? I argue that there are 5 mechanisms that mediate upsurge in availability and how people experience them. The first one is that by and large, the routines whereby we consume information are not primary anymore, are what I call derivative. We ask Sandra, who's a psychotherapist and works at home, has a home office, when was the last time? Every interview started in the same way and then went in different ways. The first question was, tell us the last time that you got news. Right? Her answer is, last time was when I was doing household chores waiting for a client. Right? And she said that that's typical. Right? She had a little bit of a break. She was mopping the floors. She gets the news. Norberto, who's a teacher, gets the news on radio, and also in a derivative fashion. When I mow the lawn, when I cook, when I do this, when I do that. Same for digital, right? When was the last time? We asked Juana, and Juana said, well, I was going to my university and I was walking and getting Twitter. And then when I got to the cafeteria, I stopped. So she wasn't walking to the cafeteria to get news. She was walking to the cafeteria, had about 12 seconds to kill. So she checked Twitter, happened to be, encounter a story on Twitter, and then, read that. Same on Facebook, right? People do not go on Facebook to get the news. People go on Facebook for other reasons. Sometimes they encounter the news. So contrary to the stylized image that we have from the 20th century, the routines are not primary, but derivative. Second, people don't really have to obtain information anymore. It's not that there is a lot of information. If there was a lot of information, but people would not develop a series of cultural predisposition towards that, that wouldn't have an impact, or perhaps not the same impact. But what the research shows quite clearly is that people are fully aware. They perceive that information is ambient. They do not need to obtain it. And they enact a series of practices that to deal with that. Julian, who's a film producer, for instance, says, with Facebook and Twitter, there is like a spillover theory of the news in which you eventually find out what's going on in the world. Estefania, who's a clerical employee, concurs. Everything is so immediate today that, for instance, many news, I don't even have to go to La Nación, which would be our quality news site. because on Twitter, when something happens on the other side of the world, you do a refresh and you get that immediately. And the same happens with TV, right? For the most part, TV is on, but nobody's paying attention to that. So the statistics about news consumption in Argentina are quite comparable to the Bureau of Labor Statistics here in the States. Right? It's about 2.5 hours. In Argentina, it's 3, according to our surveys. The national governmental surveys, not ours. In the States, it's 2.5, going up to 4 if you're a retiree person. But for the most part, what comes up in the interviews is that nobody pays much attention. Right? TV is something that is on, right? As a lifelong habit, not something that I really pay attention unless I get a message on WhatsApp, and then I turn the volume up. When people turn the volume up and they, come into contact with news, their assumption is that the content that they get is biased. Bias is the norm. Perception of bias is the norm, is not the exception in a country like this. Right? The idea of objectivity, impartiality, independence, etc., kaput. Okay? When we ask people to rate their level of agreement with the following statement, the news media of my country report the news independently of political powers, 2.5 more people disagreed than agreed. When a little bit down the survey, we flipped, instead of political, we said economic, we got the same result. This is why, Carla says, one cannot forget the idea that news has an intention, a connotation of either political partisanship or business reasons. We tend to think that within the menu of kind of news, newspapers, print newspapers are the higher quality, which is why it's quite damaging that Carlos, a computer programmer, says, none of the Argentine newspapers seem to be objective enough to trust in the news. They mix news and opinion, and they don't take ownership of the fact that they are biased. I was lucky enough that within the 158 people that were interviewed, about 12 or 14 of them had personal encounters with events that ended up being covered in the news. Okay? None of them, not a single of them, one of them was satisfied with what they got. This is one example. It makes you think, what bastards, because they were saying a bunch of wrong things and it makes you feel really badly, blah, 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 blah. So if all these things happen in my small town, I imagine that at a greater scale, it's all super manipulated. Because the idea is that what you get is of lower quality, right? The higher quality is exception, lower quality, right? It's already tainted. If you're gonna consume it, you have to develop a series of media literacy practices to try to distill the truth, right? What's factual and what's not. In stories that are particularly important to the interviewees, they tend to do, and this is very consistent with research done in the States and in India, in Nigeria, and Kenya, they tend to listen to multiple sides, only in those stories that they really care. A more interesting position that is default for several of interviewees is what I call focus on the known other. So of the spectrum of possible news stations, news sites, channels, etc., some are known to have a particularly partisan take, and while others pretend not to. So number one, the sites that pretend not to be partisan, they are trusted less, because everybody has an intention. So if you are trying to disguise that intention, that makes you less trustworthy. So the pretension to try to be objective actually undermines the goal of being objective. So if you have a very clear take, even if I don't agree with your take, I'm going to listen to you. I'm going to discount, like in golf, right? The handicap. I'm going to discount what I think is the additional distortion that you are adding. And I'm going to counter that with my social media feed, which is of the other persuasion. I'm going to try to figure out what's the average, right? This all sounds very engineered. It is what people tend to do and develop as strategies to cope with a system that is providing information of a lesser quality as routine. And then not only they think that information is of a lesser quality, but when they encounter it, it makes them feel badly. And this is also consistent with research that we've done in the States and in other countries, the States in particular. So today I read a Facebook, on Facebook, Todo Noticias, which is a domestic news channel, story about that somebody had found a newborn within a garbage bag, says Sophia, who's a clerical employee. Why? What's the need to publish that story? They're all bad news. There isn't a single good news. It's pure angst. This is the culmination of about 40 years of strategy by newspapers and TV stations, etc., trying to attract audiences by being sensationalistic. So this is what happens when you do that to a population over, and this is not only applying to Argentina, applies to many other countries, over a multiple decade span of time, right? So you maybe get the attention, but people sort of have a negative take on it. There is so much news that makes you feel badly, says Marta, who is a maid. You see that I prefer not to see them, which is why I found almost no attachment to the news. In the book, one thing I do is try to understand, this idea I can't part ways with. I remember last time we had some conversations about, the physiological mechanisms underlying, impossibility to disconnect from this. The same from social media, the same from serialized fiction, in particular binge watching. I found almost no equivalent to that in the case of news, with one exception, which is the small number of people who read the print newspaper routinely, who are very attached to coffee and tobacco. And it's that combination, right, in the context of Argentina, connects people and attach people to the experience. We have a paper on that where we did comparative analysis. Give me a second, Jamie. In 5 countries, Argentina, US, Finland, Israel, and Japan. And what we have found is that in Finland, it's less coffee and more using the newsprint to heat the sauna. But print does have these. Yes, Jamie, my friend.
I was just going to ask, is that print always on paper, or is that electronic news?
Print on paper.
Okay.
Like you go to the coffee, your favorite coffee place, it still has a smoking part, right? Or you sit outside, print is the smell. Even
what
in
was
Japan,
the rough percent? Was it like 80%?
What?
Like of the people who read the newspaper on print, like, was it virtually everyone had that attachment?
No, and we did not ask that in the survey. That comes from the interview. So if you imagine that 3% do it as a main form of news, and 15, 20% do it somehow, of the 158, that's a very small portion. So I did not quantify, but it came up time and again, and it's consistent with the comparative research. So, so just one data point to illustrate this. This figure is the number of seconds that an average visit to a top 50 digital news site in the state, right, lasts. So that's a figure that oscillates between, a little bit less and up to 150 seconds in the States, and has been very consistent as measured by Pew. So it's self-reported, but as measured by them. 150 here is the number of minutes that the median viewer of their favorite Netflix thriller devotes every day. The first week, a new season of that thriller is released. Comedy is 120. Okay, so my behavior with Casa de Papel is completely consistent with the average of the population, which makes me feel less guilty, which tells you 144 seconds, 150 minutes. And you see the imbalance between one and the other. So the news is everywhere, but experientially, the value has gone down dramatically, right? You have a lot more, and people might tell you in surveys that news is very important, they might tell you in interviews, but when you start looking and digging into how they relate to it, right? They have devalued it. So why? One of the things that I do in the book, so I take a page from Adam Smith's, I play a little bit with the title of The Wealth of Nations, to try to contrast this, what I call poverty of facts, with the wealth of fictions. Right? I don't have time to go over the data for this is the following chapter in the book, but just to give you a little bit of a flavor of the analysis. right, descriptively, and then I will try to explain it. So what I found is that the consumption of entertainment, in particular mediated entertainment, which is the vast majority of entertainment consumption, predates the pandemic, and with the pandemic has increased dramatically, tends to be primary. Even if people are on multiple screens, when they watch Game of Thrones, when they watch, that's what they are doing, and that's a primary focus of attention. Entertainment is everywhere, and people do perceive that they have plenty of choices. So the idea of ambience is more or less the same. Consuming entertainment makes them feel really good. Even the devotees of the horror show, which makes you cringe, gives you stomach upset, and sometimes gives you nightmares, still talk about it with an incredible level of love and passion and enjoyment. Because fiction does not pretend to represent reality, there are no problems of distrust. And in particular, with serialized fiction, there is an incredible level of attachment to it. So then why do we have this difference, right? So previous slide is to say it's not necessarily because of the content. There is a whole lot more content here, could have been devalued, right? But it's not, right? First point is, in terms of a possible alternative explanation, it's not because we have so much more content, because that would also apply to entertainment. It cannot be driven by technological innovation, because actually we have probably the best tools to tell stories that we ever had in history. From multimedia storytelling to data journalism, it has never been before. And that's why at the high end, we have the best content in history. You go to the New York Times, you go to the Guardian, El País, go to the smaller sites, you have probably the best journalism that it has ever existed. So what I argue is that what is behind this is a series of cultural dynamics that have much less to do with news, information, and communication per se, and much more to do with the character of everyday life and how news consumption in this particular chapter is embedded within broader routines and broader associational cultures that end up as a byproduct of embedding the whole lot more information that we have and the issues of distrust, et cetera, within this. What comes out is a very devalued, right, role of the news. So what this means is that perhaps we do need to take a page from Nick Couldry's work and Dave Morley, Sarah Pink, Sean Morse, etc., and start providing explanations of communication behavior from non-communication and non-mediated standpoints. A lot of the people who study media, information, news, etc., tend to focus on, right, the centrality of the media and of communication for people and for the scholars, where in this case, perhaps it is not applicable. This kind of analysis in the book helps to bridge the intellectual fragmentation that has occurred in the field over the past 20 or so years. That has been very good for certain processes of knowledge creation, but it has also made more difficult to kind of contrast what happens with the case of news and the case of entertainment. And because of that, perhaps it is time to rethink some key notions about the role of news in society that were premised on the idea that people experientially value the news when they actually don't. And that might provide a little bit of an in into understanding, what this means within the context of the crisis in the appeal and authority, cultural authority of institutions, the institutions of modernity, of which news is one of them. So just to give an example of what happened, something that happened last week, to bring a little bit of an Argentine flavor home. This is my compatriot, footballer Lionel Messi, scoring his first goal for Paris Saint-Germain, wearing number 30 for the first time. This is from his Instagram feed. He got 14 million likes of a series of 5 pictures, 14 million likes. If you go to the New York Times and its Instagram, the previously posted the 20 posts previously posted garnered less than 10% of what Messi garner in terms of engagement. This is not just exposure. Somebody needs to press a button or to press the screen in order to get a like. So essentially, it takes the New York Times to between 200 and 250 stories to get the same level of valuation that the world's population gives to a story, to an Instagram post by Messi. I'm not talking the entire Paris Saint-Germain, right? Paris Saint-Germain, if you add Mbappe, Neymar, Verratti, etc., you get much more. If you add the entire Ligue 1 in France, you get even more. This is the paper of record in the English-speaking world, and probably one of the most influential institutions of society. Do we really think that the media sets the agenda? If it takes this for Messi, and it takes 250 to get the same. I mean, Messi is really good, and this was a beautiful goal. Nonetheless, okay, so this is in part what this kind of analysis, I think, invites us to rethink in terms of how we understand the role of media and information in society, and what might be some of the factors driving this kind of shift, of which both media analysis and scholarly analysis have, in my opinion, lagged far, far behind. Thank you.